At 04:17 on the morning of 8th of March 1944, over the frozen fields of Wendling, Norfolk, the engines of a B-24 Liberator roared to life. In the bitter cold, grease-caked hands tightened bolts, while the distant rumble of German bombers filled the sky. Chief Warrant Officer George Duke Spitzer, crew chief for the 392nd Bomb Group, wiped his brow with the sleeve of his heavy coveralls. His eyes darted to the wings' flaps. They weren't moving right. A moment of panic. His mind raced through the options when tried. But time wasn't on his side. A bomber like this, stripped of any margin for error, needed to take off in minutes. He knew the odds. The maintenance log showed cracked hydraulics, and the field was littered with grounded B-24s. He slapped his palm against the wing, then glanced at the gum wrapper in his pocket. "This'll have to do," he muttered, fingers working with practiced speed. The sound of the bomber's engine turning over in the distance didn't comfort him. It pushed him forward. At 06:45 on that same morning, outside a hangar on the airfield, the crisp morning air stung like glass. The bomber crews, soaked in sweat and freezing winds, were pushing their B-24s to the limits. Duke stood on the tarmac, his boots crunching against the snow as he made his rounds. Every B-24 was the same, a hulking mass of steel and machinery, but every piece had a flaw. The crew chief moved from one bomber to the next, mentally counting the hours he'd spent fixing fuel lines, patching gashes in the wings, and bending over engines that had been abused beyond reason. As Duke approached a Liberator, he saw something out of place. The hydraulic lines. They were leaking again. "Damn it," Duke muttered. He glanced up, locking eyes with his mechanics. "We're running out of time. Get it fixed." The men scrambled. The bomber had to be airborne in an hour. The sound of whirring engines and the sudden roar of a distant B-17 sent a chill down his spine. Each crew chief had his own battle, but Duke's battle was made harder by the fact that no one could afford to ground a plane, not with the pressure of the upcoming raid over Europe. Records from the 392nd showed that between February and March of that year, serviceable aircraft rates had dropped to 63%. Every bomber mattered. Every repair bought time. Duke moved along the line, his clipboard clutched in one gloved hand. The wind cut across the open field. Ice formed on the metal surfaces faster than the mechanics could scrape it away. In the distance, the control tower radio crackled with updates from 8th Air Force Command. The mission was still on. The target, Berlin. The time on the clock seemed to accelerate. Duke's mind raced through a checklist, but it wasn't his mind that needed to be sharp. It was his hands. He felt the cold of his gloves as they worked against him, but the pressure of his task pushed him forward. A B-24's bomb bay doors hung open, cold metal peering through. He reached for the hydraulic valve, turning it with force, a click that filled the silence, then a moment of relief, until a mechanic's voice cut through. "We've got a problem, Chief," the young mechanic, Langston, said with a frown, holding up a piece of torn metal tubing. "This won't hold. We're going to need a new part." Duke squinted at the tube. He knew they didn't have it in stock. Not here. Not now. "Damn it," Duke hissed, his fingers running over the crinkled piece of metal. He could feel the frustration mounting, the uncertainty creeping into his chest. But he couldn't afford that. Not here. Not in this hangar. In the corner of his mind, he recalled a piece of advice his father had given him. "Always work with what you have, son, not with what you need." Duke scanned the hangar, a roll of electrical tape, a set of pliers, and something that glinted in his pocket. A shiny gum wrapper. A simple object. But in the right hands, it could save a life. The maintenance records from Wendling noted frequent shortages of hydraulic components throughout early 1944. Supply lines from depots in Burtonwood were stretched thin. Crew chiefs improvised daily. What wasn't recorded in official logs became legend in the hangars. At 07:02 that morning, Duke stood by the B-24, staring down at the cracked hydraulic line. There was no time for a full replacement. He needed something temporary, something to get this bomber in the air. Without hesitation, he pulled the crinkled gum wrapper from his pocket, carefully unwrapping it. With steady hands, he fashioned a makeshift seal, wrapping it around the cracked tubing. The crew watched him in silence. Langston raised an eyebrow. "You sure that's gonna hold?" Duke's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "It'll hold long enough," he said, securing the wrapper with wire. His breath was visible in the icy air as he straightened up. It was a temporary fix, but that was all he had. The bomber had to get in the air. The engine started with a deafening roar. The crew chief slammed his hand against the metal fuselage, giving a hard thumbs up. He didn't wait for approval. His attention shifted immediately to the next aircraft, and the next. The aluminum foil from cigarette packs and gum wrappers had been used before in field repairs, not officially sanctioned, but effective enough to hold pressure seals temporarily. The technique relied on the foil's malleability and resistance to immediate corrosion. In freezing temperatures, the temporary seal could last hours, if not stressed beyond operational limits. By 08:00, 12 B-24s from the 392nd were taxiing toward the runway. Duke watched them go, each one a collection of improvised solutions held together by skill and necessity. The roar of engines filled the morning. Exhaust trails hung in the cold air. The mission brief had called for precision. The reality was survival. By 10:30 that morning, the airfield was a sea of moving bodies. Duke was everywhere. Here, checking another B-24's landing gear. There, helping a mechanic patch a fuel line. The sound of engines and the smell of jet fuel were constant companions. Each plane had a story, a history. But today, they all seemed to have one thing in common. They were all barely holding together. As Duke watched another bomber take off, the reality of the situation sank in. A single crack, a missed repair, a broken seal could ground an entire squadron. The stakes were always this high. The mission brief had already been delivered earlier in the morning, another bombing run over Germany. The plan was clear, but the execution was always a delicate balance between speed and safety. It was in that moment that Duke's mind flickered back to the gum wrapper. He hadn't told anyone. The fix hadn't been perfect, but it worked. No one could risk saying something that could jeopardize the mission. But now the mission wasn't just about hitting targets in enemy territory. It was about keeping his crew alive. 8th Air Force records from March 1944 showed operational loss rates averaging 4 to 5% per mission. For every 100 bombers that took off, 4 or 5 didn't return. Mechanical failures accounted for a fraction of those losses, but they were losses nonetheless. Every repair bought a crew another chance. Duke moved between the remaining aircraft, his hands never still. The cold had numbed his fingers, but muscle memory guided each movement. Tighten, test, move on. The rhythm of maintenance work under pressure, no time for second thoughts. At 12:12 that afternoon, the bombers began their pre-flight checks. Duke moved between them, taking his time to inspect each one, each bolt, each wire. As he reached the B-24 with the gum wrapper seal, the memory of the quick fix still hung in his mind. He could feel the pressure weighing down on him, but there was no time to second-guess his decision. "Chief, we got a problem with this one," Langston called out. Duke looked over. The problem wasn't what he'd expected. The gum wrapper. It was still holding. But the other systems? They weren't. It was a flaw he hadn't foreseen. "Get the backup parts," he snapped. "And get 'em fast. We don't have much time." The clock ticked louder in his mind. Every second was precious. The roar of engines in the distance was a reminder of how little they had left. The hydraulic system on a B-24 Liberator consisted of multiple independent circuits. Failure in one didn't necessarily mean total failure, but it reduced redundancy. The wing flaps, bomb bay doors, landing gear, and brakes all relied on hydraulic pressure. A compromised line could affect any of these systems. Duke knew this. Every crew chief knew this. He watched Langston and two other mechanics work on the backup hydraulic pump. The replacement part had been salvaged from a damaged aircraft 3 days prior. Not new, but functional. In wartime maintenance, functional was good enough. The mechanics worked quickly. Their hands practiced. Within 20 minutes, the pump was installed and tested. Duke checked his watch. 12:47. The mission was scheduled for early afternoon. The bombers would need to be ready within the hour. He moved on to the next aircraft, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning for anything out of place. At 01 WWII that afternoon, Duke was back at the hangar, moving with urgency. The B-24 was almost ready, but the hydraulics was still a gamble. The gum wrapper might have been holding, but without the proper parts, nothing could be certain. He slammed his hand against the hull of the bomber. "Get the backup tools, now!" The mechanics jumped to action, tools scattered across the tarmac. Duke's eyes stayed focused. He knew this was a high-risk maneuver. Every minute, every action counted. The engines hummed louder. A heavy breath of tension was all around him. Across the field, other crew chiefs faced similar challenges. Aircraft 427536 had a faulty oxygen regulator. Another Liberator showed stress fractures in the tail assembly. Each problem required immediate attention. Each solution was temporary. The goal wasn't perfection, it was mission capability. By 01:30, the final checks were complete. Duke stood back and watched as the B-24 with the gum wrapper seal rolled toward the runway. The pilot gave a thumbs up from the cockpit window. Duke returned the gesture, but his mind was already calculating risks. If the seal failed during flight, the crew would lose hydraulic pressure. They'd have to manually crank the landing gear down on return, assuming they returned. The bomber lifted from the ground, engines roaring. The gum wrapper, for now, had done its job, but Duke knew it wouldn't hold forever. Not against the pressure of combat. Not with the world watching from the sky. Historical records from the 392nd Bomb Group noted that improvised repairs were common throughout 1944. Official maintenance logs rarely reflected the full extent of field modifications. What mattered was that aircraft remained operational. The methods were left to the discretion of experienced crew chiefs. By mid-afternoon on 8th of March 1944, the formation of B-24s from the 392nd climbed to operational altitude. Duke remained on the ground at Wendling, monitoring radio traffic from the control tower. The static-filled transmissions reported formations assembling over the English coast. Weather conditions were marginal. Cloud cover over the target area was expected to be heavy. Duke walked back to the hangar, his mind still on the hydraulic repair. He'd seen temporary fixes hold for entire missions before. He'd also seen them fail catastrophically. The uncertainty was part of the job. What separated good crew chiefs from great ones was the ability to calculate acceptable risk. Inside the hangar, other mechanics were already prepping for the return flights. Damage assessment would begin the moment the bombers touched down. Flak damage, engine wear, hydraulic stress. Every system would need inspection. The turnaround time between missions was measured in hours, not days. Duke pulled out his maintenance log and began documenting the morning's repairs. The gum wrapper wasn't mentioned. Some things didn't make it into official records. Instead, he wrote, "Hydraulic line temporarily sealed. Section 4A, starboard wing, monitor on return." That would be enough. By 02:30 that afternoon, word came through that the formation had reached enemy airspace. Anti-aircraft fire was reported as heavy. 2 B-17s from another group had already turned back with engine trouble. The mission continued. Duke sat on a workbench, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The waiting was always the hardest part. On the ground you had control. You could fix things, adjust things, make decisions. In the air, all you could do was hope your work held. Records from that day showed that 21 B-24s from the 392nd participated in the Berlin raid. 19 returned. At 03:45 that afternoon, the first signs of trouble emerged. A radio transmission crackled through the control tower. One of the bombers reported hydraulic pressure loss. The voice was calm but urgent. Duke's heart sank. He knew which aircraft it was before the tail number was called. "Tower, this is Big Duke, tail number 427489, experiencing hydraulic failure, starboard system, bomb bay doors won't close, requesting emergency procedures." Duke closed his eyes. The gum wrapper seal had failed, or something else had given way under the stress of combat maneuvers. Either way, the crew was in trouble. The bomber couldn't return with open bomb bay doors. The drag would burn through fuel reserves before they reached England. The pilot had two options: attempt a manual closure using the emergency hand crank, or jettison the doors entirely. Both carried risks. Duke listened as the tower relayed instructions. The crew would attempt manual closure first. If that failed, they'd need to consider alternatives. The static-filled transmission made it hard to hear clearly, but the tension in the pilot's voice was unmistakable. By 04:00, the formation was beginning its return flight. The damaged bomber had managed to partially close the bomb bay doors using the manual crank system. Not ideal, but functional enough to reduce drag. The aircraft would be slower than the rest of the formation, more vulnerable to enemy fighters. The decision was made to drop back slightly, relying on escort fighters for protection. Duke remained in the control tower, listening to every transmission. The waiting stretched on. Minutes felt like hours. The sound of engines finally reached Wendling around 05:30 that evening. One by one, the B-24s appeared through the clouds, banking toward the runway. The damaged bomber came in last, its approach slower than normal. Duke watched from the tower window. Landing without full hydraulic pressure meant manual brakes. The pilot would need precision. By 04:13 that afternoon, the B-24s were over enemy territory. The roar of the engines was drowned out by the distant rumble of flak and bombs falling. Inside the cockpit, the crew focused on the task at hand. But for Duke, the real danger was back on the ground. His mind raced as he thought of the makeshift seal holding the bomber together. He could only hope it would hold long enough to get them back to base. The B-24 banked sharply. The metallic shriek of the airframe strained. The hydraulics fought to keep up. Anti-aircraft fire peppered the sky around the formation. Black smoke bursts marked near misses. The bombardier called out corrections, adjusting for wind and altitude. The target, industrial facilities on the outskirts of Berlin, lay ahead through broken cloud cover. In the radio compartment, the operator monitored frequencies for fighter warnings. The Luftwaffe presence had been lighter than expected, but that could change at any moment. German fighters typically waited until after the bomb run, targeting damaged or straggling aircraft on the return flight. The formation held tight. Each bomber maintained position through the flak field. At 04:19, the lead aircraft released its payload. The others followed in sequence. The B-24, with the compromised hydraulic line, dropped its bombs without incident. The temporary seal, for now, continued to hold, but the stress of combat maneuvers, sharp banks, altitude changes, the vibration from bomb release, all took their toll on aircraft systems. Small cracks widened. Seals that held on the ground failed under pressure. The aluminum foil patch on the hydraulic line began to separate. At 0425, the formation turned for home. The damaged bomber's crew noticed the hydraulic pressure gauge dropping, slowly at first, then faster. The seal had given way. Fluid leaked into the wing cavity. The system was failing. At 0504 that evening, Duke's worst fears were realized. The radio crackled with a report from one of the B-24s in the squadron. The hydraulic system had failed. The wing flaps were stuck, frozen in place. The bomber was losing altitude. A crew member's panicked voice echoed over the radio. "Mayday! Mayday! We can't get it to lift." Duke's eyes narrowed. His heart pounded. The systems back at the base had failed again. The gum wrapper. It was holding, but it wasn't enough. It had only delayed the inevitable. "Shut it down," Duke ordered, slamming his fist against the radio, his eyes wide. But the call was already too late. The plane dropped. There was nothing anyone could do. The damaged bomber fell behind the formation. Without hydraulic pressure, the crew lost control of multiple systems simultaneously. The wing flaps remained locked in their last position. The bomb bay doors, already compromised, couldn't be secured. The pilot fought to maintain altitude, but the aircraft continued to descend. At 0518, the crew made the decision to abandon the aircraft. The bailout order was given, one by one. The crew members jumped into the cold air over the French countryside. Parachutes blossomed against the darkening sky. The bomber continued its descent, empty now, spiraling downward until it struck the ground in a field outside Beauvais. In the control tower at Wendling, Duke listened to the final transmissions. The static-filled reports confirmed what he already knew. The aircraft was lost. The crew had evacuated. Their fate, whether they'd reach friendly territory or be captured, remained unknown. Records from 8th March 1944 showed that the 382nd Bomb Group lost 2 aircraft over enemy territory that day. 1 to direct flak hit, 1 to mechanical failure following combat damage. 9 crew members were listed as missing in action. At 0545 that evening, Duke stood silently by the radio. The bomber hadn't returned. The sky was quiet except for the ever-present hum of engines in the distance. He watched the shadows grow longer, his mind replaying the moment of the gum wrapper. Had it been enough, or had he put his crew in danger? It was a question without an answer, and Duke knew that the real cost of survival wasn't found in metal or mechanics, but in the men and women who fought every day to keep the machines alive. The other bombers had landed safely. Damage reports were being compiled. Flak holes needed patching. Engines needed servicing. The work never stopped. But Duke couldn't shake the image of that bomber going down, the crew jumping into the uncertain sky over occupied France. He walked out to the flight line as dusk settled over Wendling. The air had turned colder. Ice was already forming on the metal surfaces again. Tomorrow there would be another mission. More repairs, more improvised solutions, more risks calculated in the moment with incomplete information. A fellow crew chief approached, hands shoved in his pockets against the cold. "Heard about Big Duke going down. Tough break." Duke nodded. "Yeah, tough break." The other man hesitated, then added, "You did what you could. We all do. Can't replace parts we don't have." Duke didn't respond. The logic was sound. The outcome didn't change. Later that night, Duke sat in the NCO quarters updating his maintenance log. Under the entry for aircraft 427489, he added a final note. "Lost to mechanical failure. 8th of March 1944, over France. Crew evacuated. He paused, then closed the logbook. Official records rarely captured the full complexity of wartime maintenance. They noted losses, documented repairs, tracked supply shortages. They didn't record the weight of decisions made in frozen hangars at dawn, when time ran out and improvisation became necessity. The war would end eventually, but the cost of survival weighed heavily on those who lived through it. The planes returned to base, some with new dents, others still holding on by a thread. But every bomber that returned meant one more day that Duke could walk on the tarmac, inspecting, repairing, making sure his team survived. In the weeks following 8th of March 1944, supply lines improved marginally. The depot at Burtonwood increased its shipments of hydraulic components to forward bases. Crew chiefs continued to improvise, but with slightly better resources. The loss rate remained high. Combat operations over Germany intensified as spring approached. Duke continued his work at Wendling. Each morning brought new challenges. Engines that wouldn't start, electrical systems that failed pre-flight checks, battle damage from the previous day's mission. The rhythm of maintenance work became automatic. Inspect, diagnose, repair, test, move on. By late March, word reached the base that 3 of the crew members from the downed bomber had made contact with resistance networks in France. They were alive, moving south towards Spain. The other 6 remained unaccounted for. The Red Cross would eventually confirm their status, some as prisoners of war, others as casualties. The gum wrapper. It was a footnote in history, but to the men who flew, it was the difference between life and death, or perhaps it was simply another variable in the complex equation of survival, one factor among hundreds that determined who returned and who didn't. Duke never spoke about the temporary repair. It wasn't documented in official reports. No investigation followed. Mechanical failures were too common to warrant individual scrutiny unless they revealed systemic problems. The incident faded into the background of a larger war effort. Records from the 392nd Bomb Group noted that between March and May 1944, the unit flew 62 combat missions over occupied Europe. Aircraft availability rates improved slightly as supply chains stabilized. Losses continued. At the end of it all, the B-24 crews would leave their marks on history. But Duke had his own mark to carry: the weight of survival, the price of ingenuity, and the reminder that sometimes, in the heat of battle, the smallest of things could hold the biggest consequence. The war in Europe concluded on 8th of May 1945. By then, the 392nd Bomb Group had completed its operational mission, participating in the strategic bombing campaign that had systematically dismantled German industrial capacity. The cost had been measured in aircraft lost, crews killed or captured, and the accumulated strain on those who kept the machines flying. Duke returned to civilian life that summer. He carried with him the memories of 1,000 repairs, 100 emergency fixes, and the knowledge that improvisation had been as essential to victory as production capacity or strategic planning. He didn't speak much about the war. Most veterans didn't. In the decades that followed, historians would analyze the strategic bombing campaign from multiple angles. They would debate its effectiveness, calculate its costs, and examine its moral implications. The maintenance logs from bases like Wendling would become archival material, studied for insights into operational logistics and aircraft reliability under combat conditions. The gum wrapper would never be written about in the history books, but for those who knew, it was the thing that kept the war machine rolling just a little bit longer. It represented the gap between theory and practice, between official procedure and battlefield reality. It symbolized the countless undocumented decisions made by crew chiefs, mechanics, and technicians who understood that perfect solutions were luxuries, and survival depended on making imperfect solutions work. The maintenance log from 8th of March 1944 survived in the National Archives. The entry for aircraft 427489 remained brief. Lost to mechanical failure. The details behind that single line, the frozen morning, the missing parts, the temporary seal, the crew's final moments, were left unrecorded. In the official record, it was mechanical failure. In the hangar, it was silence.